for something a little different from Psalm 42. As the deer panteth for the water, so my soul it longs for you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. As the deer panteth for the water, so my soul it longs for you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone let my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. I want you more than gold or silver, only you can satisfy. You alone are the real joy giver and the apple of my eye. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone let my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. As the deer panteth for the water, so my soul it longs for you. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship you. Well, if I could, I'd surely
Welcome, church, and welcome to Downtown Disciples. We are a progressive faith community doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly together with our God. We are LGBTQIA affirming, and we proclaim Black Lives Matter, and we say those things at the beginning of every worship service because those things matter to us. Another way that I'm always so pleased and overjoyed that we open our worship services with are with music, are with the inspiring tunes and inspiring words that Mary Beth Martis LaCroix always brings us. And I think one of the reasons that I love hearing those songs is because of the stories that those songs tell, because I think songs can tell a story in a way that very little else can. I mean, where else can we hear about Moses smoking the water with a 2x4, or hear about how we long for God and how God longs for us like a deer pants after running water, like a creature has a need to be nourished. I think that the songs and the stories that we tell together always call us into new imagination and new stories. And that's what I'm hoping that in our time together today, we can be called into a new way of hearing and telling and being the story that God is telling in the world together. So we know that one of the ways we can hear God is through story. And as a talker, it's the one I prefer. But one of the other ways that we can also hear God is, of course, through silence, where God speaks internally and where God is made known in the still small voice of our conscience that we hear in our heart. So I want to invite us into a period of silence before we hear yet another beautiful song and before Ashley calls us into our call to worship. So if you'll join me in a moment of reflective and contemplative silence.
Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The tune is The House of the Rising Sun. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a soul like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace
My name's Ashley. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the worship leader for today. Will you join me in the call to worship? Holy One, who knows us more intimately than we know ourselves,
Ground us in the knowledge that we are your beloved.
you place our stories in and among the stories of creation.
Help us tell the stories of our individual and collective lives together.
Spirit, who nudges us toward justice, Redeemer made flesh and history, Creator who creates this broken world anew.
Equip us with the tools, the conviction, and the compassion to do the work of justice. Help us to tell new stories of unity, hope, and equality.
In the knowing and the speaking of our stories, may we be challenged and comforted as we move through times of transition.
We need you. We need one another. Help us to tell a new story of justice.
Together, we are the body of Christ. Amen.
So we'll turn now to another form of storytelling in a story that we tell every week together in our feasting and our communion that we share. That to keep each other safe, we now share at a greater distance, and we now share through many forms and many elements that we gather across time and space on Zoom and on Facebook Live to gather together our elements and our lives as we feast together. So we remember a time when Jesus gathered with his friends. And perhaps it was a time that felt something like this, a time where there was great political uncertainty, a time where there was the threat of harm, where there was division, where there was strife. And we know that at that time, there were dominant stories that ruled the day, and that those were the stories of empire, of the Roman Empire, of the powers of the world who sought out to stifle Jesus's message of liberation and freedom. But we also know that the reason Jesus gathered his friends together was to tell a new story, a story of hope, a story of togetherness, a story of community. And we know that one of the ways that Jesus told that story was that he took ordinary bread in the same way that we today take, I'm looking in the chat here, fruit snacks, coffee, biscuits, jam, spaghetti, trail mix, whatever we take, the ordinary elements that we take in our home today. And he took that ordinary element and he made it something extraordinary. That he took it, he broke it, and he gave it to his friends, even and especially his friends who would betray him, who had broken the story or who had tried to break the story of love and justice and compassion. And he gave it to them and said, "Take this, all of you. This is myself. This is me, broken and given for you. Do this in memory of me." And we know that after the meal was finished, Jesus took the cup, again, an ordinary cup, but in this case, a cup that was reserved for the Messiah. And then, in Pastor Debbie's favorite words, and my favorite words that Pastor Debbie says, he poured out the cup. And then he had the audacity to give the cup to all of them as if they too could do the Messiah's work. So, friends, I invite you, with the ordinary elements in your own home, to take a moment of communion. And in that moment of communion, may you feel connected to our stories that we tell together as a Downtown Disciples community, and to the new stories that are breaking forth in the world. Amen.
Just as I am, without one plea, but that your love was spread for me, and that you called, inviting me, O Lamb of God. I come, just as I am, though tossed about with many a conflict, many, many, many a doubt, fightings and fears within, without, O Lamb of God. I come, just as I am, you will receive, will welcome apart and cleanse, relieve, because your promise, oh, I believe, O Lamb of God. I come, just as I am, your love unknown has broken every barrier down. Oh, to be yours and yours alone, O Lamb of God. We come, we come.
Thanks to Mary Beth. I want to invite folks into two other ways that they can continue to be a part of our story today, which is on that last slide. There are ways that you can continue to give to support the mission of Downtown Disciples. And if you have particular prayers, if you have particular ways you would like us to uplift your story as part of our story, you can drop prayers for us to uplift either on Facebook, if you're watching the Facebook Live, or to chat them, as Ashley said, directly to her to lift up later in the service. So those are two great ways that you can join the story that we are telling together. But I think one of the ways that I want to invite us into a story is with our children's time today, which is one of my favorite times, because at Downtown Disciples, you don't actually have to be a children to be part of children time, that this is a time for everyone to be invited in, and for me to share time with those who are children in our community and those who are children at heart. So when I was thinking about this moment, I was thinking about the coloring page that Carrie sent out earlier this week for worship today. And this coloring page has a great message on it that says, believe in yourself, which would have been enough right there, right? But it says, believe in yourself a little more. And I wonder if there are times when many of us have believed in ourselves, but we just needed to believe in ourselves a little bit more. Because that doesn't feel like a whole lot, but I think in some ways it can be a whole lot. So, children and children at heart of Downtown Disciples, maybe there's a moment when you didn't believe in yourself. Maybe there's a moment when you used to believe one thing, but now you believe something different. And in that new believing, you believe in yourself just a little bit more. I used to believe a lot of things about myself, that I wasn't very good at certain things, that I didn't have certain talents or certain skills. And I still believe some of those things. There are still things I still can't do. I still can't dance very well. But part of the things I had to do to believe in myself a little bit more was to tell a new story and think about the new things that I believe. So I hope that one of the things that we can do today, as we all grow, children and adults alike, are to think about the things we used to believe, to think about the things that we believe now, and how the things that we think change. And they change so much, and that change can be hard, but that change can also be good. And it's a sign that we're learning and we're changing together. So one of the ways that I learned and changed that Ashley reminded me of at the beginning of this worship service is something that I forgot to do at the beginning of this worship service, which was sharing my pronouns. So my pronouns are he and him. And I think learning how to do things like sharing my pronouns was a new learning that helped me believe in myself and helped others believe and speak about themselves. So I want to close our children's time with a little prayer. And I'm going to say one of the things that Debbie says that I always love, which is that I'm going to say something to God. And if you agree with it, then I want you to say it back to God with me. So, loving God, thank you for the things that I think and the things that I believe. Thank you for the things that change and the things that don't change, because we know that the things that don't change are that you love us, no matter what we think about ourselves, and that you push us and encourage us to believe in ourselves just a little bit more. Amen. So now, as we continue our story together, and I want to thank Ashley for mouthing along the prayer with me and making me realize how fast I went through that prayer. We remember that the story we're telling together includes old stories and stories that might be a little confusing and might not make a lot of sense to us, but that we want to try to make sense of together. So today we're going to hear a parable from the book of Matthew, the parable of the bags of gold. So sometimes this is called the parable of the talents, but let us hear this old story and think about how it might affect the stories that we are telling together. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and so I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. God, we thank you for this word, for its deep challenge and its conviction. So, the first time I ever heard this parable, I was sitting in a purple pew. I always joke that my white upper middle class Catholic parish looked a little bit more, or a lot a bit more, like a DMV than a church, with modern architecture that included gray carpeted floors, wood paneling, shingles, and red-brown brick, and only a smattering of the statues you would expect in the high vaulted ceilings of the cathedral downtown. And this parable, notably, was nearly always told in the context of improving the church building. Specifically, it was nearly always shared in the context of some kind of capital campaign, our efforts to expand, build upon, and later replace our church building. And that's because what's commonly translated as talents in this story deals pretty explicitly, depending on the translation that you're dealing with coins, with gold, with bags of gold, with money. And in this telling of the story, the metaphor translates nicely, right? God, who in this telling of the story is associated with the man who goes out on a journey, had given all of us gifts, and God had given some of us money. We're expected to put that money to good use and to God's use by giving generously to the church. We shouldn't be like the third enslaved worker who squandered his wealth by burying it in the ground. We should grow our wealth, and we should give our wealth back to God. You can already see where this is going to get tricky. The priest at the time had a repetitive phrase that we would hear in nearly every sermon, and maybe some of you have heard it before. Give of your time, your talent, and your treasure. And we would hear this over and over again. Time, talent, and treasure, because all of these things were from God. And all of these things should be given back to God through gifts to the community. And like I said, it certainly helped that in some translations of this text, including this one, the amount of money given is described as a talent. This metaphor made sense to me. largely due to my upper middle class context. My dad worked in finance, and I knew what investments were. Specifically, I knew phrases like return on investment, which is a tool for understanding if your money is doing what it's supposed to do. Again, this parable made sense to me because of my context. I understood that money could and should be invested, and that money should be invested in things like the church and not wasted. And it wasn't until I got to college that I discovered an interpretation of this parable that turned my world on its head. In an undergraduate course on liberation theology, I was exposed to the works of scripture scholar William Herzog, who, besides having a great name, argued for a different interpretation of this parable. So in his writings on this parable, Herzog first points out how many of his predecessors interpreted this parable, which casts God in the role of the traveling man, the ruler, and God's people in the role of the enslaved workers. In this interpretation, God has entrusted the people with teachings, religious values, and cultural norms, but they have squandered them, pursuing policies of exclusiveness that leave people out, and burying the richness of God's tradition and the people's traditions in the ground. The kingdom of God, the end times, the time when God's reign is coming on the earth, is rapidly approaching in this story. And those who have not used God's words for good will be thrown out into a cold world where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And this interpretation is likely. Jesus, a Jewish prophet, had plenty to say about how his fellow Jews should interpret the law that had been entrusted to them by their sacred covenant relationship with God. And I think it's always good for Christians to be reminded that this was not a repudiation or a denial of Judaism, but a critique offered from inside the tradition. In this interpretation, Jesus reminds his fellow Jews about the spiritual and religious gifts they have been given and urges them not to squander it, because they will be held accountable if they do. In this interpretation, Jesus sounds a lot like the people who, in many traditions and at Downtown Disciples, call their religious leaders back to a more just and faithful living of religion in the world, who are not afraid to call out their religious leaders and challenge those who share their tradition. God has given us spiritual gifts, Jesus says, and we should embrace the fullness of those gifts and grow their effectiveness. So I do think it's always important to remember that Jesus was speaking as a Jew to Jewish audiences, but it wasn't this rebrand that turned my religious and economic view of the parable on its head. Herzog argues against this interpretation of the parable and specifically argues for a new view on who the parable's hero is. So I want to ask, if you want to drop it in the chat, this is a fun like mini poll. Who, maybe not in your opinion, but who in the story we're looking at here, who's the hero? Who's the protagonist? Who's the central figure? Who represents the good, the right, and the just? So if anyone wants to drop it in the chat, who do you like in this story? Who seems like the central figure or the protagonist or the hero of this story? I see gears turning, which is always good. So this raises an interesting question of, is it hard to find a hero in this story? And I think it is. But it's also important to point out that in both the American capitalist interpretation I was given in childhood and the interpretation that Herzog argues against, the answer to that question is clear for some interpreters. The hero of the story, although we may not like him, is the man going on a journey, who Herzog points out has always been assumed to be a God figure in this story. God is, in a hymn that some of you may recognize, the giver of all good gifts. To the book of James, both economic and spiritual. He, and I do say he on purpose here because this gift-giving God is always wrongly presented as a man, is a man who hands out bags of gold and expects a return on investment. But then Herzog points out, we have a problem in this story. Because if this figure is God, then the description that's given by the third enslaved worker is nothing short of scandalous. This enslaved worker calls the traveler a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. And that doesn't sound like the loving God that I know and the compassionate God that I serve. And the words that this character in the story speaks also don't sound like the loving God that I know. He says, "You wicked and lazy slave, you ought to have invested my money with bankers, and then I could have received what was my own with interest." This doesn't sound like the God that we know, a God of justice, a God of freedom, a God of liberation. And when the enslaved worker calls the traveler a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed, interpreters often have an explanation for what they call in this article, one of my favorite things, which is this character's sauciness. And he's pretty saucy to the traveling man. Herzog acknowledges that other interpreters have ways of explaining away this characterization that the third person brings forward. The third enslaved worker is perhaps trying to distract attention from his own failures. He speaks out of fear and insolence. He's trying to distract from his own shortcomings so he won't face the punishment that's his due for squandering time, talent, and treasure. But Herzog, like a good liberation theologian, who I think would find many interpretive friends at Downtown Disciples, completely flips the parable on its head, beginning at the parable's very start, where the supposed God figure is described as going on a journey. And he reminds us that at this time, travel was reserved for the very wealthy elite. These elite were rich men who would travel abroad in hopes of increasing their wealth through political and business schemes, entrusting the wealth and affairs of the household to those who worked for them. Herzog argues that these workers, the three workers highlighted in this story, were less likely slaves and more likely something akin to middle management, court bureaucrats who sought to increase their wealth while the head of household was away on business. While the cat's away, the mice will play, or something like that. And there were a few ways that these household workers could have gotten a return on their investment and could have gotten a little bit rich in the economy of their place and their time. They could have made high interest loans to poor farm workers with interest rates, and I want any of us who have loans here to think about these interest rates, with interest rates that ranged from 60 to 200%. They also could have bought and sold luxury items popular among the wealthy urban populations of the time. However they got that money, Herzog argues, the poor and the dispossessed, the workers and the peasants, would have been the ones who paid a hefty price. The first two workers do the ruler's dirty work, exploiting others for profit and filling their own pockets in the process. But the third worker refuses. In Herzog's words, when he puts the money in the ground, he takes it out of circulation. He refuses to participate in the system of exploitation and abuse that undergirds the economy that he works in. Herzog calls him a whistleblower and the real hero of the story. And it's clear that when the third worker blows the whistle, he blows the whistle very loudly. He gets, as Herzog would say, saucy. He points out what the poor and the oppressed in that local economy already know, that the master of this wealth and the concentrator of power is a harsh man, reaping where he did not sow and gathering where he did not scatter seed. He looks the oppressor directly in the face and he says two things. First, he says, I know what you do. I know who you are, and I have seen the harms of your power. And secondly, he says, in the words of that Twisted Sister song, we're not going to take it. To be more specific, actually, he says, I'm not going to take it. He's likely already unpopular with those harmed by his work in this ruthless system of repression and exploitation, which is why burning this last bridge, his connection to power and prestige, is so remarkable. He chooses conviction over comfort, and he gives up his power to be thrown out among the poor into a land that the poor know well, where there's weeping and gnashing and chattering of teeth. So, is this the correct interpretation of the parable? Yes, and no, and maybe not. As we know here at Downtown Disciples, where we do things like digging through stories together and asking hard questions, even questions that might make us feel like a heretic, there are many ways to interpret these old stories in our contemporary contexts. There are qualified scholars much smarter than me who have disputed, challenged, and entered into conversation with Herzog's interpretation, offering new lenses and worldviews through which we can interpret this parable. And that's why, for me, the question is not getting to the correct interpretation of this parable, challenging and distressing though it may be. I think in many ways that misses the point of parables and of scriptural teachings, which never truly have a correct interpretation as they are interpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted in new contexts every minute of every hour of every day. The question for me is, are we willing to have our understanding of biblical texts shaken to their core? Are we willing to read these texts in a way that challenges the comfort of our whiteness, of middle and upper class security, of our maleness? And Liz already got it. 5 minutes ago, while I was rambling on, Liz says the third enslaved person was speaking truth to power, which seems heroic. Downtown Disciples is already doing this work and asking these hard questions about what texts mean. So in his interpretation of this text, Herzog points to one of my favorite books. Oh, I have it by my bedside table. I'll bring it out. The Gospel in Salentiname. This book, written by Catholic priest, artist, and revolutionary Ernesto Cardenal, is a transcription of the conversations that Cardinal had with poor farm workers, campesinos in Nicaragua, where he invited these workers to interpret the gospel. In the chapter on this parable, Oscar, one of the poor workers tasked with interpreting this text, sees what Liz saw. He sees the traveling man as an exploiter. He also recognizes instantly how the ruler, in his own words, clearly looked out for others who were exploiters like him to further his project of wealth concentration. So how does Oscar, in just a few sentences, get to the heart of what it takes snotty academics like me years to debate about and fill annoying thesis chapters with? He sees the exploitation in this story because he has lived exploitation in his own life. He knows what it means to have an abusive and exploitative boss or ruler. He knows what exploitation and abuse feels like in his body and at the core of his being. As poor agricultural workers, Oscar and the campesinos read this story with different eyes and a different embodied experience. They didn't sit in the purple pews of my white, wealthy, wood-paneled Catholic Church at the heart of America's military and economic empire, where our biggest concern was the capital campaign and increasing donations to the collection plate. Friends, if we are going to rethink the interpretation of our scriptural texts, we are also called to something bigger, and for me, something much more challenging. We are called to reinterpret our lives. And for so many of us here, that work has already begun. So many of us have had to rethink the religious teachings and the scriptures of our childhood. We've left behind interpretations of scripture and interpretations of Christian life that promote homophobia, transphobia, and sexism. Just this week, I was talking to a few people about how the abuse crisis and sexism in my home tradition of Roman Catholicism means that when I do go to Mass, I can't put money in the collection plate. It's a hard decision for me, but it grew out of reinterpreting how I understood scripture stories like this one and my faith more broadly. And that's why I'm so grateful for spaces like Downtown Disciples, where we're empowered to question the text, to grapple with it, and where I know the money I give goes into doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly together in the work for real transformative change. And I never want us to grow complacent, because this work of reinterpretation is lifelong, and it should always be a challenge. It calls on us to reconsider who the heroes of our lives are. It calls on us to not just hear, but act upon the cry of the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, and the dispossessed. So friends, what are we going to do when the liberal heroes of our lives make choices that harm the earth and our neighbors? What are we going to do when Joe Biden props up the war economy? What are we going to do when the good liberals on the Des Moines City Council condemn and silence the voices of the Black liberation movement? What are we going to do when the good organizations we support don't live up to their values and support white supremacy and inequality through their actions and our actions and inactions? What are we going to do when we as Downtown Disciples don't always live up to our values? What are we going to do when we ourselves fail time and time again in the work for justice? What are you going to do? What am I going to do? Again, I don't know the answer to any of those questions. And that's because I have failed and continue to fail in the work for justice. I have fallen silent when I should have spoken out. I have leaned on comfortable interpretations instead of the ones that will challenge me to change my life and my work towards justice. I have chosen my own power and my own desire to climb that social ladder over being a whistleblower and an accomplice in the work for justice. But friends, here is the joy and the reminder that I think we always need to ground ourselves in. We are imperfect, but God is perfect. We make mistakes time and time again, but God's parental love and grace, God's mercy, and her belief in our potential are boundless. God's Spirit is always nudging us towards reinterpretation of our life stories. And their love is expressed in the love we have here in communities like Downtown Disciples, where we offer each other both nourishment and challenge. Every day, we can and we do choose solidarity. We can and we do choose love. We can and we do choose to reinterpret the stories we read and the stories we live. And friends, I know that we'll do it all with God's mysterious grace and the loving support of this joyful, hopeful, justice-working community. Amen.
Now will you join me in the prayers of the people? Loving storyteller, we often struggle to hear your words among the noise of consumerism and violence.
Help us to find ourselves in your story of love.
You remind us to speak boldly about the values we share, values of equality, of justice, of freedom and liberation. You remind us that we must tell stories that reflect your love.
Help us to speak your liberating truth.
We want to tell stories of life, abundance, and joy, but we too often give in to the myths of scarcity and fear. We fear death, illness, and pain. We fear financial insecurity, the destruction of our planet, the division of our people, loneliness, and isolation.
Remind us that your love always has the last word.
White supremacy, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia flow from pulpits that claim your name. Preachers promote war and fall silent on issues of economic injustice. We reject these lies and speak your truth. Everybody has a right to live.
Help us speak love, justice, and compassion.
Often we do not say enough. When our voice shakes, when we are too afraid to offer criticism or speak out for change, you are a still small voice within. You call us to act, to speak, and to tell a story that includes all of your beloved creation.
Push us to speak more boldly, more clearly, and with more love at the center.
In the midst of noise, we know that you are speaking. You speak in history, in our hearts, and in the collective struggles of the outcast, the oppressed, and the marginalized.
Help us to know and to heed your voice.
One who created the world with a word, you are a God of justice and of mercy. You forgive us when we tell stories of injustice, and you call us back to a more inclusive, transformative, and hopeful story. Your mercy endures forever, and no one is outside of your love. Let us recall now the times we have failed to fully reflect that love. Hear the good news. A new story of love, peace, and justice. God's grace knows no bounds. Her mercy is all encompassing, and it stretches across time and space to embrace all of creation.
We are blessed to be forgiven. We are empowered to be forgiving.
Compassionate Creator, you love all the world that you have created. Help us tell new stories that protect our earth, uplift working people, and affirm the dignity of every human life. Help us sing new songs of racial and economic justice, stories that transcend prison bars and gender binaries.
Speak your healing power into our hearts. Speak to us about justice, companionship, equality, comfort, and rest. Make us your movement for wholeness in this fragmented world.
We lift up prayers for Fred Rothfuss's family and Angela Rothfuss's family, some of whom have tested positive and are having symptoms, and some who haven't. We lift up prayers for all of them.
I'll lift up.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
We pray for people in Iowa and in the Midwest as COVID surges, hospitals are filled, healthcare workers are sick and fatigued. And we pray especially for people who are particularly vulnerable due to underlying conditions. God, in your mercy.
Hear our prayer. I pray for all the whistleblowers we have in our COVID situation who are telling the truth about what we need We are telling the truth about what healthcare workers need and about how we can move towards a place of healing. And I pray for everyone in our Downtown Disciples community who hear and respond to difficult stories with our stories, which are ones of hope and love. God, in your mercy.
Receive our prayer. We pray for Pastor Debbie and her whole family, for Kelsey and for Grayson, for strength, healing, safety, for restoration, for her safe journey back from Kansas. We pray that they would feel your love, God, and your peace and your strength. We pray for Lynn and Jerry after the death of their 18-year pet Heidi that now makes the house seem empty. God, in your mercy.
Receive our prayer.
May it be so. Amen.
Amen. So we close with a time of blessing, a blessing of the stories of all of our lives. Receive now this blessing, a blessing that no matter what stories we are telling, and in the midst of national stories of difficulty, of sickness, corruption, of pain, and the stories of our lives that involve hard things like death, like transition, like illness, and like strife, that we will all be grounded in God's story of love and in the new songs that God is singing and the new stories that God is telling in our community. Amen.
Well, the moon is broken and the sky is black. Come on up to the house. The only thing you can see is all that you lack. Come on up to the house. You know you're crying, don't do you no good. Where we can use the wood. Come on up to the house. You gotta come on up to the house. Come on up to the house. This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. Come on up to the house. There's no light in the tunnel, no irons in the fire. You gotta come on up to the house. And you're singing lead soprano in a junk man's choir. Come on up to the house. Oh, does life seem brutish, nasty and a short? Well, come on up to the house. The seas are stormy and you can't find no porter, so come on up to the house. You gotta come on up to the house. Well, church, now come on up to the house. This world is not our home, we're just a passing through. We're gonna come on up to the house. Ooh, yeah. Come on up do. Come on up to the house. And you've been whipped by the forces that are inside of you. So come on up to the house. Well, you're high on top of your mountain of woe. Come on up to the house. You know you should surrender, but you can't let go. I've been there, you've been there too. Come on up to the house. Well, now, come on up to the house. Come on, come on, come on. Come on up to the house. This world is not our home. We're just a passing through. We gotta come on up to the house. Where will you join me there? We're gonna come on up to the house. I said we're gonna come on up to the house. This world is not our home. We're just a passing through. So we gotta come on up to the house. You're invited. Oh, won't you come on up to the house? Tell your neighbor to come on up to the house. Even our enemy, we gotta come on up to the house. Come on, everybody, we're gonna come on up to the house.